Well, thank you very much, Georgina, for that welcome. And it's lovely to be the second act after the Prime Minister, but you never complain about that, do you? And it's an absolute pleasure, though, to formally open this conference and I guess informally open the Robert Menzies Institute. The formal opening of that is going to be tonight by someone who another person I dare not upstage, being Josh Frydenberg, even though he is a Monash graduate, I'll point out. But I guess he is the member for Kooyong and the deputy leader and the treasurer of the country. So, you know, that's fine, Georgina. It's great to be with so many friends here. I recognise so many of you. I particularly recognise Michael Cromlin down the back there, who was my dean when I was actually here. And I know still a member of the faculty, but Lee Clifford, obviously the chairman of this institute, and thank you to you and the board members for getting this up and running. Nick Cater having such an important role. Ex-members of Parliament, I see 4 just from up here, but particularly acknowledgement of David Kemp, former Education Minister, and really one of both a political giant and now an intellectual giant for Liberalism, David. So it's a pleasure. I know you're kicking off this conference straight after me, so I'll keep my remarks short. But listen, it is my pleasure to open this conference, your very first at this institute, which has been proudly supported by the federal government to the tune of $7 million. And the institute, of course, as I think Georgina notes in her forward, is actually the 6th prime ministerial library after Alfred Deakin, John Curtin, Gough Whitlam, Bob Hawke, and John Howard, and now Robert Menzies. And I must essentially say, I don't know why it took so long to have one for Robert Menzies, our longest serving Prime Minister, and someone who, as Dr. Zachary Gorman points out, built or at least shaped modern Australia. So I think it's actually very fitting that we do have this, and we quite rightly study and reflect on his time, and as we do with other political leaders, and we quite rightly study and reflect on our history, and we should do more of that, including in our schools. But history is ultimately made up of the actions of individuals and of groups, and of course there's arguably no more significant individual in modern Australia than Robert Menzies. As the Education Minister and like David Kemp, I'm particularly informed by Robert Menzies' philosophy on schools and universities, and the Prime Minister touched on this. Robert Menzies had a very clear vision for education, and he said that the purpose of education was to equalise opportunity for individuals. It wasn't to equalise outcomes. It's very clear on that. And he said that because that was the best chance of each individual achieving their potential. But he also realised there was a collective good in that. Because as he pointed out, with each individual achieving their potential collectively, that is also going to be in the best interest of the development of the nation. And consequently, he delivered many policies to achieve those ends, as the Prime Minister indicated, massively expanding higher education, delivering real school choice for school-age children, including famously starting school aid for Catholic schools, which has obviously extended and continued since that time. Some of his most passionate writings that I noticed were actually about school teachers. And he stated that their task was such that, and I'm quoting him here, that if performed well, can do more to produce good citizens than all the acts of parliaments ever passed. That was his view of school teachers. A lovely quote, and I think absolutely right. At the university level, of course, he was a very, very passionate believer, Georgina, in free speech and the contest of ideas. I mean, he knew that universities had to be spaces for arguments and debate. They must be, as he said, custodians of mental liberty and unfettered search for truth. That's what he said. And it was arguably this search for truth at our universities, which at least contributed to the immense increase in wealth and prosperity and freedoms during his time. I probably would say that if Robert Menzies was around today, I think he'd be, a bit aghast at some of the more recent trends on university campuses. The concept of deplatforming, I think, would be completely aghast. He would be completely aghast to, of shutting down debates, of deliberately not hearing certain views. I think that was absolutely contrary to his political philosophy, and certainly it's contrary to mine, and something that I'm working very hard on, and I think we're making some success in achieving with new codes of conduct to govern universities to protect and enhance freedom of speech and freedom of academic inquiry. Today, as Georgina outlined, your conference is covering the early years from 1894 to 1942. What a time in Australian history that was. The very foundations of this nation, the bloody battles of World War I, the Great Depression, and then of course the beginning of World War II after the end of the war that was to end all wars, obviously didn't achieve that objective. And it was a time when, again, Georgina touched on this, when the very foundations of liberal democracy were really put to its test. And Robert Gordon Menzies was very clear and articulate, like other global leaders, in defending the very principles which we take for granted in many cases today. Again, something that is very dear to me and high on my agenda is actually to ensure that students today at the school level understand that we shouldn't take these democratic principles for granted. I get appalled when I see survey data which says that 19 to 29-year-olds, 40% don't think that democracy is necessarily the preferred form of government. 40%. I mean, which other form of government do they prefer? They can have a look at some of our not too distant neighbours to assess that. So it's, again, an absolute essential principle which we again have to impart onto our students. Something which I take very dearly from Robert Gordon Menzies and want to ensure that that continues in our schools, and something which, again, I look to one of my great predecessors, David Kemp, which he so dearly championed as well. Of course, that time that you're covering today was also the period for Menzies himself when he studied right here at this very place. He succeeded in the Victorian Parliament. He succeeded in the federal parliaments. He became the Prime Minister for the first time. And as we all know, that Prime Ministership was soon ended. But it was also, perhaps most importantly for him, the time when he delivered, again, what Zachary pointed out in the foreword as being arguably the most important contributions, intellectual contributions to political debate of any political leader in Australian history. And that is the Forgotten People's radio addresses, now known as the Forgotten People's speeches. And Nick Cater has been so good at the Menzies Research Centre in terms of reinvigorating those speeches. And I know that's something that is going to be deeply, again, studied here, as it should be studied for all people in schooling and certainly people who are doing a liberal arts degree. You've got a tremendous lineup today. I'm not going to hold those up. You're kicking off with the great David Kemp. I know you've got other people such as Justice Edelman, I think will be absolutely terrific. I can't see him here. But Judith Brett as well, who wrote a very important contribution, which I recall reading when I was a student back in the early 90s, and many others. A great day for the Institute, a great day for Australia to be kicking off this conference, to be formally launching the opening of this Institute. And Georgina, I wish you and your board, headed up by Lee Clifford and so many other directors, very, very well for this conference, but importantly for the work that this Institute does for this year and the years ahead. Thanks very much for having me.